but nevertheless, 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 we're nevertheless, nevertheless, it's, but nevertheless, so, but nevertheless, 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 but nevertheless, 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 but nevertheless, 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 you know, nevertheless, nevertheless, but nevertheless, 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 but nevertheless, nevertheless, but nevertheless, it's nevertheless, 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 but nevertheless, 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 but nevertheless, nevertheless, neat, nevertheless, but nevertheless, 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 but nevertheless, nevertheless, but nevertheless, it's, but nevertheless, nevertheless, but nevertheless, nevertheless, but nevertheless, it's, nevertheless, nevertheless, but it's there, nevertheless, 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 but nevertheless, I made it, nevertheless, but nevertheless, but nevertheless, but nevertheless, yet nevertheless, but nevertheless, so nevertheless, but nevertheless, but nevertheless, getting nevertheless, but nevertheless, here, nevertheless, so nevertheless, but nevertheless, we, but nevertheless, but nevertheless, for nevertheless, but nevertheless, and the nevertheless, there it is, nevertheless, but nevertheless, also nevertheless, but nevertheless, so nevertheless, that's nevertheless, but nevertheless, but nevertheless,